friends, hello there. We are underway in our new series on the parables of Jesus. If you did not have a chance to watch last week's episode, I would highly recommend that you do so, as it will give you a context for how Jesus leveraged the power of story. And in this episode, we're actually going to talk about the parables themselves as far as a form or a structure. And then next week, we're going to start our journey into the various parables. And we're going to be looking at some parables we'll just need one episode for. Other parables we'll need 2 or 3 or maybe even more episodes for, because some of them Jesus has really layered, and there is so much to mine and understand in what Jesus is doing. And so it's going to be a blast. Hey, and for those of you, by the way, who end up watching this on YouTube, I know many of you watch this on the site, but if you watch this on YouTube, one of the things that helps gets the word out about this series and the teaching series is just to like the video, and also just to hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new teaching is underway. So if you're a YouTube user, would really like to invite you to do that. And I know for the rest of you, you're like, really? Like, I don't even engage it on YouTube. Totally fine. One of the big things that we're doing right now is working on ways to help get this teaching series out to more people, because as you all know, it's entirely free. And if you're watching it, you probably feel like the content is worthwhile to you on your journey. And so this is one way in which we can help get the word out that doesn't cost anybody anything. So there you go. All right, so for those of you who are just tuning in, one of the things that we mentioned last week is that during the survey we did at the end of last year, one of the questions we asked our audience, you, was what is something that you want us to tackle that you believe will help you understand something in the Bible when it's set in its context. And one of the top 2 answers you gave was, we want to understand the parables. And so the parables are amazing. They are just completely layered in their sophistication, and I am so excited about unpacking some of Jesus's most well-known parables in the weeks to come. But for this episode, I want you to better understand just the nature of the parable itself. And I want to go back to a passage that we referenced last week, but also spent some time talking about in the week before, the episode before that, called To Do and to Teach. And the passage that we looked at was from Acts 1:1. So this is Luke writing, and he says, "In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach." And we talked about how Jesus would give people these experiences, and then out of those experiences, he would instruct them. And we talked about this kind of teaching method of Jesus. Well, when it comes to the parables, one of the things that we find is that one of the ways that Jesus is teaching people out of an experience is giving them these parables, giving them these stories, which, as we explored in last week's episode, are experiences in and of themselves, right? Whenever we hear a story, we get drawn into a story. We feel part of a story, and that is an experience in and of itself. And so one of the fascinating things that Jesus does in utilizing parables, in utilizing these stories, is that at times he's in the midst of an experience, but the people do not understand the point that he is trying to make, or they don't like the point that Jesus is trying to make. So, for example, Luke 15, we have 3 parables. We have the parable of, the shepherd who has 100 sheep and one gets lost. We have the parable of the woman who has 10 coins and one is lost. And then we have the story of what is called traditionally the prodigal son. And these 3 are working in succession to one another. They're linked together. And when you look at the first part of Luke 15, the experience that's unfolding is that Jesus is sharing a meal with a bunch of quote-unquote tax collectors and sinners. And the religious leaders are angered by this experience, and therefore out of this experience, Jesus will give them 3 stories. And the stories themselves are experiences as well. And so this connects us back into all that Jesus began to do and to teach, the MO of Jesus. Now, in other cases, Jesus makes a point, and then in order to illustrate the point, he will give parables, and typically you get 2 or 3 in a row. So it's not really kind of like an experience the people are in. It's that Jesus is kind of launching into an experience. He's made a point. Again, maybe they didn't understand it or they didn't like it. And now Jesus is giving these stories as a way for people to experience what he's trying to get across. Again, it's just utterly brilliant what Jesus does with the use of the parables. And again, last week's episode will help clue that for you or fill that in if you haven't had a chance to watch it. Now, what I just mentioned here, that either out of an experience Jesus will give the parables, or he'll make a point and then he'll use the parables in order to affirm what he is saying, this actually goes back to a passage in Deuteronomy. And it's so cool. Check this out. Deuteronomy 19:15 reads this way: 1 witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. Now, I know if I'm just listening to this in your shoes or watching this, I'm going, what does that have anything to do about Jesus's usage of parables? Okay, well, check this out. This original context is if you are witnessing a crime. But when it says on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed, throughout the Bible, even in the Hebrew scriptures as well, but definitely in the New Testament, is this idea of on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. This is used to confirm anything. So yes, it's still used in the context of if you witness a crime, but if you wanted to solidify anything, you would want to have 2 or 3 witnesses. In fact, this sentence, this statement is quoted verbatim at least 3 times in the New Testament. In Matthew 18:6 and John 8:17 and 2 Corinthians 13:1, something happens and then explicitly it's said, hey, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. And so it's very overt. But one of the other things that you see is how that not from an overt perspective, but from more of an implicit perspective, this shows up in the ministry of Jesus. It also shows up in the ministry of Paul and in the New Testament. But one of the things that you see is that Jesus will be making a point, and on the heels of it, he will tell often 2 or 3 parables. Why? Because the parables serve as witnesses to confirm the matter at hand. And on account of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. It's so cool. And by the way, Jesus does this with parables. He does this with illustrations. He'll often say something and then he'll give 2 examples. Once he's in the synagogue in Nazareth, and this is in Luke 4, and Jesus is speaking to the people and they're getting really amped up. They're getting really upset. And Jesus goes, so let me tell you a story about Elijah and let me tell you a story about Elisha. Why is he doing this? Because on account of 2 or 3 witnesses, he's confirming his point. And it's all over the place. And it's so cool how he utilizes that. And so this is why you find the parables oftentimes in pairs of 2 and 3. Now, speaking of the parables and showing up all over the place, one of the things that we recognize, and we highlighted this in last week's episode, is that 1/3 of Jesus's teachings are parables. So 33% of the time that we see read in our Gospels when Jesus has his recorded teachings, he's actually utilizing parables. Now, here is a misnomer that I have heard a lot being part of the church growing up, is that Jesus invented the parable. Okay, friends, Jesus did not invent the parable. Okay, he perfected it. But let's just go back to this first point here, that he did not invent the parable. The parable was the preferred teaching method of the rabbis. Jesus is a Jewish rabbi functioning in a very Jewish world, and a primary communication tool among all the rabbis was the use of parables. And so Jesus is not doing anything new. This level of sophistication is new, and I'll get to that in a moment. But friends, we have thousands of parables from before, during, and after the time of Jesus that are recorded in classical rabbinic literature, Jewish literature of the rabbis. Parables are everywhere. So Jesus did not invent them, and this is helpful because one of the things that Jesus is doing is he's drawing on the assumptions that his audience would have when he starts some of the parables he tells. So when he says, well, there is this, and there is this, and there is this, in the minds of the audience, they go, oh, we know what comes next because we know of all these other parables that begin with this, this, and this, and then Jesus changes it, and that's the moment where the audience goes, oh man, we better buckle up, because this is not what we normally hear. And that's the point. It is the change that indicates that Jesus is doing something new, and he's going to go after his audience in a really interesting way. So if you know that backdrop, that helps you to understand what's going on in the minds and in the hearts of the participants as Jesus is telling the story or the parable that we're going to look at as we go through the series. Now, I mentioned that he perfected it, and here's what I mean by that, other than the fact that you understand what perfected it means, is that one of the things that I got to do is when I got to live and study in Jerusalem, I got to study under a rabbi. And I got to take several courses with this rabbi. One was on classical rabbinic literature, and another one was on Jesus and his parables. And what was fascinating to me is that this rabbi, his life's work had been around classical rabbinic literature, and so he was intimately familiar with the thousands of parables that show up in the Jewish literature. And I remember on one occasion, he saying this to us as a class. He said, these parables that Jesus tells are on a level of sophistication never witnessed in the ancient world. That Jesus' parables, he said, are more layered, are more sophisticated, are more charged, are more challenging than any of the other parables that we have from the rabbinic world. In fact, he said at one point, the ancient rabbis could not hold a candle to the parables that Rabbi Jesus told. And by the way, this guy is not a messianic Jew. He doesn't believe Jesus is the Messiah. He just recognizes that Jesus was this brilliant communicator. Now, as followers of Jesus, we know that Jesus is more than that. We believe Jesus is more than just a brilliant communicator, but he's no less than a brilliant communicator. As I mentioned in the last week's series, I believe Jesus is the greatest communicator in human history. And again, one of the ways he leveraged that was through parables. But friends, they are so layered, and that's one of the things that we're going to do in this series is understand the layering Jesus does in order to fully embrace what Jesus is communicating as we unpack the context of the parable in which Jesus gave. And so this is how we understand parables. Now, many of us have probably heard a definition of parables that goes something like this, that parables are earthly stories with heavenly meanings. And this has always troubled me. And then I came across a quote from a guy by the name of Klein Snodgrass, who's a brilliant scholar. And if you have a name like Klein Snodgrass, you better be a scholar, because that is a wicked cool name to have as a scholar. I'm not sure if it's paradoxical to use the word wicked and scholar in the same one, but you all understand what's going on. Here's what he says about this definition in his book, Stories with Intent, which, by the way, is going to be the resource I am going to recommend you get. Is the most comprehensive source on the parables of Jesus. And these are going to be linked under all of the teachings. I'm going to give you a bunch of different books, but Klein is someone I'm going to reference a lot. He says, although there is some truth in this saying, this approach to understanding New Testament parables will not do. Parables are much more than illustrations, and although some are concerned with future eschatology, which means for the things that are to come in the future, they are not about heaven. They are directed to life on this earth. Now, for some of us, we may hear that and we go, wow, that's a little different than how I've been taught. But friends, this shouldn't surprise us at all, particularly for those of you who got to journey with me during the Lord's Prayer series. In that series, I did a teaching about how heaven comes here, about Jesus' entire life and ministry and message was about how the rule and reign of God advances here on earth. Essentially, how heaven comes crashing into earth to push out the brokenness and the pain and the chaos and to reinstate shalom. God is getting back his good world, and it's happening through the life and ministry of Jesus Christ first and foremost. And then Jesus is teaching his disciples on how they emulate what he is doing so that heaven continues to crash to earth and to push out the darkness and the chaos. And so if Jesus' entire message is about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, and by the way, if you did not watch that episode, go back and watch it. It will help you to understand where we are going with these parables and where Jesus was going with his parables, because Jesus is training his disciples on how to bring forth God's kingdom in the world through partnering with God for the things of God. And so this shouldn't surprise us that Jesus is getting after like what's going on right here, right now. The action is here, and the parables are a primary training method for us as his followers to understand how to understand and then live out his message. And so this gets to another point that people have, is many people think that parables are allegories. Okay, the parables or a parable is not an allegory. Technically, that should say parables are not allegories. But the idea of allegory is that we assign all of these meanings to every single piece of the parable. And it is amazing to me how many parables I have heard people expound upon from an allegorical perspective, and you're going, that has nothing to do with the context. That does not even understand what Jesus is saying, and that makes no sense whatsoever. Now, some of the parables have allegorical aspects where this part does mean this, and this part does this mean, and this part doesn't mean this, but those are few and far between. And so one of the things that I just want to prep you on is that if you have an allegorical approach to the parables, putting it in context, you aren't going to get the allegorical connections. And that's because Jesus wasn't intending the allegorical aspect. That was something that developed after the time of Jesus and then got put back onto the teachings of Jesus. And it's also one of the reasons why we've not really understood Jesus's teachings of the parables in their original context, which is exactly what we're going to seek to do in this series. So there you go. But here's the thing I want to end with. And this is very, very, very key, because when we talk about it being about things right here and right now, this is one of the things that Jesus is doing in the parables. And I love how Klein Snodgrass captures this. He says, parables enlighten and instruct, but often with a message that people do not want to hear. Friends, Jesus told these stories in order to wake up his audience, in order to communicate his life-transforming message. And friends, when you recognize what Jesus is doing in the parables, these parables are incredibly explosive. That's why we're calling, this series Jesus and his explosive parables, because they are going to mess with us. And I want to warn you up front, Jesus' teachings are not comfy and cozy. Jesus can be very difficult. And one of the ways that he communicated his message in a way that people had to wrestle is he told these brilliant stories that made them wrestle with the implications of what he was saying and wrestle with the fact of whether or not they were going to walk it out. And so I just want to warn us that these stories are going to get into our grill. These stories are going to push us, and these stories are going to change us and challenge us. And if we live them out, I believe they're going to change us. And friends, this is really good news, because we do not grow without tension and challenge. Anything significant you do in life is going to be something that pushes you, that's going to challenge you. And I believe that the reason why you're watching this episode or you follow the teaching series is that you are interested and serious about wanting to understand the Bible, not just as head knowledge, but how we can walk it out and experience the transformational power of God in our lives on a daily basis. And friends, one of the ways that we're going to learn how to do this more effectively is digging into Jesus and his explosive parables. So friends, there is that last foundation piece for us. Next week, we are going to launch into one of the parables. I can't wait to get into the specifics of the parables, and it's going to be a fun journey. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and may you walk out the text well in your life.